Find the derivative of y equals x cubed divided by g of x, then evaluate y prime of negative 1, where g of negative 1 is a negative 2, and g prime of negative 1 is a 3. Y here is the quotient of two functions, one that is known, x cubed, and one that is unknown, g of x. Since we have a quotient, we will use the quotient rule for the derivative. The derivative y prime, or dy dx, will be found by the derivative of the numerator, power rule, 3x squared, times the denominator left alone, minus the numerator left alone, times the derivative of the denominator, we will call that g prime of x, and then all over the denominator, g of x quantity squared. So there's our derivative, y prime or dy dx. The next thing to do is to evaluate y prime of negative 1. Y prime of negative 1 means to plug a negative 1 in for each of the x's. So we will have 3 times negative 1 squared times g of negative 1 minus negative 1 cubed times g prime of negative 1. And then all of this is going to be divided by g of negative 1, and that entire thing squared. So 3 times negative 1 squared is a 1, and then g of negative 1 and g prime of negative 1, that's going to come from this information over here. G of negative 1 is a negative 2, minus, we have negative 1 cubed. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1, times 1 more negative 1 is negative 1. And then g prime of negative 1 is a 3. And all of this is divided by g of negative 1, which is a negative 2, and then squared. 3 times 1 is 3, times a negative 2 is a negative 6. And then negative times negative 1 is plus 1 times a 3, which is a positive 3. Negative 2 squared, negative 2 times negative 2 is a positive 4. In the numerator, minus 6 plus 3 is a negative 3 over the denominator of 4, negative 3 over 4.